Good morning. I'm really pleased to have a couple of guest speakers with us here this morning to discuss what could be a really important issue for a lot of our constituents. I am pleased that my friend Cameron Douglas, who I have known since college, and his colleague Elyssa Arnold are here. They work with the Office of Pest Management Policy at USDA, and we're going to have an opportunity to hear about EPA's proposals to address conflicts of the Endangered Species Act with current pesticide regulation and how EPA is proposing to potentially manage that with some new regulations. It is my hope that those of you who have a constituent grower group will work with Cameron and/or Elyssa to plan smaller meetings that are specific to your growers so that questions about those specific crops could be answered more thoroughly, and so that your growers will have as much of a heads up as possible before one of these proposals gets adopted. And we'll potentially have the opportunity to provide some feedback about what those could mean for their businesses. So I believe Elyssa is going to get us started today, and I will let you introduce yourself a little bit more fully.
Thanks, Tori. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Does that look okay? Great. All right. So my name is Elyssa Arnold, and I am the Ecological Risk Assessor in the USDA's Office of Pest Management Policy. And that basically means that I do all things ESA. That is like in the pesticide world, ecological risk assessment has been very focused on Endangered Species Act issues over the past few years. And I will talk a little bit more about why that is. And then my colleague Cameron Douglas is going to pick up the presentation about halfway through. He is a weed scientist and also based in Maine, so he can answer all questions about weeds and Maine. And so again, we're going to be talking about the Endangered Species Act today. So you'll hear us say ESA a lot. That's what we mean, Endangered Species Acts. And how that fits into the world of pesticides and compliance with ESA and the other relevant laws. So first, I'm not sure how familiar you all are with our office, so just want to give a little bit of background about who we are and what we do. OPMP was created by Congress in the 1998 Farm Bill, and that was in response to the concerns of specialty and minor crop producers regarding their opportunities for having meaningful dialogue with EPA on the implementation of the Food Quality Protection Act. So that was back in the 90s, but we see actually a lot of today's concerns with ESA as really a close parallel to what was going on with FQPA in the 90s. So our responsibilities are developing policy for USDA on pest management, pesticides, and agricultural biotechnology, consulting with stakeholders on pest management related actions taken by EPA and other agencies, and intra and interagency coordination with EPA, FDA, and other federal and state regulatory entities on pesticide policy issues. So we work with a whole variety of stakeholders, grower and commodity groups, pesticide registrants, other governmental agencies, cooperative extension agents, of course. And we have pretty broad responsibilities, kind of everything pesticide regulatory related, but our core work and our mission is to represent the perspective of growers, especially specialty and minor crop producers, to EPA to help inform the regulatory process for pesticides in the U.S. You can see a link on that slide. I don't think you can click on it, but that's our website. If you Google USDA OPMP, you should be able to find it pretty easily. It has a list of everyone in our office and a little bit more about what we do. We are a pretty small office. We're only 10 people, but kind of a fun fact is that the majority of us, I think 7 of the 10 actually used to work in EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs, including myself and Cameron. So we've got a lot of good understanding of how they work and what they do, and also good relationships with their team, which is really helpful. All right. So a little bit of background about, why are we talking about FIFRA and ESA and what is the issue here? So under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, federal agencies have to consult with NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service and or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we refer to them as the services when any action the agency carries out, funds, or authorizes may affect a species that's listed as threatened or endangered under the Act, or any critical habitat designated for those species. And critical habitat is something that it gets kind of confused about what it means often. So it's not just an animal's habitat, but actually a designated area defined specifically with certain features under the ESA. So some species, when they're listed, the services will designate a critical habitat, and sometimes they won't, depending on their requirements. But anyway, critical habitat is a very specific statutory thing, not just important habitat for a species. So that's the ESA law. And then FIFRA, of course, is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, which is the law under which EPA registers and regulates pesticides. So those registrations are federal actions. And under Section 7 of ESA, EPA should be consulting with the services for each of those actions, each of those registrations. But historically, that hasn't really happened. So EPA has met their obligations for those consultations under ESA for less than 5% of pesticide registrations. And there's a long history with that. I mean, we're talking 50 years of history now. And over time, there have been attempts to comply, but it's difficult because ESA was kind of built with the framework in mind of more specific, discrete, and local actions, like, building a highway, building a dam, a bridge, those types of situations where you're really looking at a specific local area and, one kind of construction or one, physical action in the environment. But for pesticide registration, they are typically nationwide. So you're talking about an action that covers the entire United States in many cases, depending on the use, but that's often the case across all of the uses of a pesticide. And there are more than 17,000 registered pesticide products at this point, containing more than 1,200 active ingredients. So it's just kind of a monumental task that doesn't quite fit in the mold of how the ESA was supposed to work. And so there's just been over time different interpretations of the statutory authorities, difficulty coordinating across the agencies, lack of resources to figure this out, disagreements with methodologies, and really insufficient data for making this work. And so it basically hasn't until now. But in the past, really past 10 to 15 years, there's been a ton of lawsuits. And the litigation has resulted in remands and vacatures of pesticide registrations. So this is basically environmental NGOs suing EPA to say you need to comply with the Endangered Species Act. And the courts have basically ruled over and over now that those NGOs are correct. EPA has to meet its ESA requirements, and they have given deadlines to complete biological evaluations, which is the first step in the consultation process. And there was quite a few lawsuits in 2011 that were combined together to cover quite a long list of chemicals, and we refer to that as the mega suit. So that was kind of the whole ball game with all these lawsuits, the mega suit, and that settlement, the final settlement for that actually just came out last September. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So that's what's driving a lot of this effort. Is these lawsuits and the courts telling EPA, yeah, you really do need to comply with ESA. So that's where they're at now. And then, where do we come in with this? Why, what's USDA's role? We are talking about consultations that are between EPA and the services. And so I don't think I've explained, but National Marine Fisheries Service and Fish and Wildlife Service. So they're different agencies, different departments. National Marine Fisheries Service is part of NOAA in the Department of Commerce, and Fish and Wildlife Service is part of Department of Interior. And just the way the act was set up originally, the NMFS, National Marine Fisheries Service, has jurisdiction over species that are in like saltwater, basically. So you're talking whales and sea turtles, corals, and most importantly for pesticides, salmon, because salmon do, of course, then swim into freshwater rivers. And then Fish and Wildlife has the rest of them. So they have the vast majority of the listed species, but both services are relevant here. So you have the consultations between EPA and the services. USDA is not formally a part of those consultations, but we are a member of the FIFRA ESA Interagency Working Group, and that was created under the 2018 Farm Bill. And that gives us kind of a formal role in the issue. And what we do with that role is to help provide the grower perspective. So the EPA and the services understand how pesticides are actually used, and the implications of the proposed mitigations that they're coming up with to protect listed species. So the services really understand the species. EPA understands pesticide labels, but they do have folks who understand agriculture, but not very many. And so they really need that extra information. And of course, not all pesticide uses are agricultural either, but we really try to represent the growers to help them understand, this might be what the label says, but this is actually what's happening on the ground. Or, there might be this maximum rate, but they only have to use that in these certain, really dire circumstances, or if it rains at this time of year, or if there's a lot of disease pressure. But typically, this is how a pesticide is used. And that helps them understand what the actual risks are on the ground. And then when they're coming up with mitigations, that means mitigations are typically restrictions on how a pesticide can be used. So that can be anything from something very reasonable that absolutely works in agriculture to something that makes no sense and essentially makes the pesticide unusable. And so we try to provide that voice to focus them on things that will actually work. And, we're focused on growers, but our goals are really all aligned. With our federal partners, we want to ensure that workable mitigations are put in place to protect listed species, because if the mitigations aren't practical for growers, they can't be effectively implemented, and then listed species won't be protected. So that's our role in this. And there's also just a little note there at the bottom showing that there's also local and regional level ESA consultations that happen between different parts of USDA who are users of pesticides, such as APHIS and the Forest Service. And so we get involved in some of those discussions as well. So what's been going on with ESA compliance for pesticides? This is kind of the typical process that EPA would go through to fulfill their consultation requirement. So EPA develops effects determinations in what's called a biological evaluation. So that's the risk assessment they put together, and that's the formal name of it in the consultation process for ESA. So those are for specific species and designated critical habitats, and they determine whether a pesticide use is likely to adversely affect an individual of a listed species. So that's the threshold for that stage. And pesticides are designed to generally kill pests or deter pests, and often those pests are going to have some similarity to a listed species, an insect pest to listed invertebrates, or a weed to listed plants. You can understand how there's going to be overlap there. And so in almost all cases, not all, but almost all, a pesticide is going to be likely to adversely affect at least one listed species. If the adverse effects are not likely, EPA has to initiate what's called informal consultation, or if they are likely, then they initiate formal consultation with the services. If there's going to be no effect, which is unusual but can happen in certain specific cases, then they don't have to consult. And then once that consultation is initiated, which is the majority of the cases we're talking about, the services then develop what's called a biological opinion to determine whether the pesticide use is likely to jeopardize the species population or adversely modify a critical habitat. So in the endless acronyms and jargon, that gets referred to as JAM, jeopardy or adverse modification. And if so, then the services go on to describe how to avoid JAM through what is called reasonable and prudent alternatives and measures. So those are the mitigations I was talking about. So you can see there's a different bar there from the biological evaluation, where you're looking at the potential to affect an individual of a species, to the biological opinion, where you're looking at, does something actually jeopardize the species population? So then EPA would implement the RPAs and RPMs through pesticide label changes, including geographically specific limitations, via a website they use called Bulletins Live 2. I hope you are all familiar at least with that name, and we can talk more about that as well. If you're not, it's definitely something that is going to impact everyone. There is references to it being put on all pesticide labels, so you will have to know how to check that website. And then consultation. So this is quite a process, and it takes historically to go through that entire process has taken many years. So full consultations have only been completed in a few cases. And especially there's been a couple specific lawsuits focused on specific species where EPA has had to go through this process. The salmonid species are one example of that. But to go through a consultation for a pesticide that's used nationwide for all uses and all species, there's about 1,700 listed species and 850 critical habitats at this point. It's a big task, and it's very rarely been completed. So, where does that leave us now? It leaves us with a need to make some changes, and that's what we're going to be talking about with the rest of the presentation. So EPA has had to kind of take a step back and say, how are we going to make this work? Because going through that process I just described, chemical by chemical, is going to take hundreds of years. I think they did calculate it out, and it's basically not possible. So in 2021, EPA started by committing to Congress to comply with ESA for over-the-top registrations of herbicides for use on genetically engineered herbicide-tolerant crops. So they started off by focusing on trying to limit those registrations to have no effect on any listed species. So they had big buffers and location restrictions and specific drift-reducing formulations to achieve that until they got to enlist, and then things changed a little bit with that case. So that was an effort that worked for those specific cases. But then I think if you're familiar with some of these herbicides, you might be kind of laughing to yourself to think that dicamba over the top uses had then no off-field effects. There's obviously a lot more to the story than that. So in April 2022, EPA released their ESA work plan, which was actually a really big deal. It was the first time EPA had ever released this comprehensive strategy to say, this is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to comply with ESA for everything. And they laid out a couple different lists of prioritization. So starting with, how are they going to prioritize the chemicals themselves on the consultations? So starting with those that have litigation deadlines, followed by new pesticide active ingredients, followed by registration review cases. That's their 15-year review cycle. And then new uses, Section 18s, and just starting to figure out how to do this for biopesticides and antimicrobial pesticides. But they also laid out some improved approaches of how they were going to more efficiently tackle these cases. So first of all, EPA is starting to make their own predictions of jeopardy and adverse modification. So trying to bridge that gap between that individual effect threshold and then where the services look at effects to the population, instead of handing the services something that then they have to, kind of completely redo to their own standard and their own regulatory threshold. EPA is trying to kind of bring their processes together so that they're handing something to the services that they can use a little bit more readily. They are trying to put together broad strategies for groups of chemicals. So you're going to hear Cameron later talking about the herbicide strategy. There will also be an insecticide strategy and a fungicide strategy. So trying to figure out ways to tackle these cases that's consistent and make things more efficient by having strategies of how to address assessments and mitigation for these types of chemicals. And then also some broad strategies for geographic areas. So the first that they're looking at is Hawaii. Hawaii has about 40% of the listed species in the U.S. and a lot of unique things. They're obviously separate from the continental U.S. and so kind of looking at them separately is something that EPA is doing already. And then finally, early mitigation for vulnerable species. So EPA and the Fish and Wildlife together identifying some species that could be particularly vulnerable to pesticides and trying to put mitigation in place, before going through that whole long process to get them protected. And I'm going to be talking more about that effort after I finish this sort of background piece. So then, pretty quickly after that first release in November of 2022, EPA released an update to their work plan, and it described how EPA would incorporate ESA goals into FIFRA, so into their normal registration process through ecological mitigation for all non-target species. So the idea is that if you reduce exposure and reduce risk for all non-target species, that will also reduce risk to listed species. And so they introduced what they called FIFRA Interim Ecological Mitigation, which includes those reference statements to Bulletin Slide 2, surface water and erosion mitigation menus, spray drift reduction measures. And so those are two areas that we're going to be focusing on a lot. Those are kind of the two main pathways EPA looks at to assess, are chemicals moving off the field and potentially affecting the environment through either spray drift or runoff, or runoff and erosion leaving the field that way. So those are two really big focuses of keeping pesticides on the field and away from non-target species. They also have some treated seed language, pollinator advisory language, reminders about the importance of reporting ecological incidents. Those are important, but more kind of advisory, so less of a concern, I guess, to us. And they've started to incorporate that approach into preliminary interim decisions in the registration review process. So we've seen that now for the rodenticides and for 7 other active ingredients, and those have gone out for public comment. So that approach really mirrors a lot of the strategies we were going to be talking about with endangered species. Also, for those of you familiar with atrazine case, it mirrors the approach that was taken for atrazine registration review. So we're kind of starting to see different iterations of these same ideas build upon each other as EPA comes out with different types of actions. Our office did comment on the work plan update that was put out for public comment, and those are publicly available on the docket if anyone's interested to see our take on that. Okay, and so finally, I mentioned earlier the mega suit that combined all of those cases for different chemicals into one big lawsuit. And the final piece of the settlement came out for that in September. And so that basically kind of codified and established court-ordered deadlines for a lot of these strategies and actions that I've been talking about. So the first is the Vulnerable Species Pilot Project. EPA published a draft of that last June. A final mitigation approach was due by December, so they did kind of post an update on their direction for that based on the public comments they received, and then they're on the hook to determine how they're going to implement and expand to additional species by September of this year. The herbicide strategy, that's the first of those chemical grouping strategies. The draft was published in July, and they are on the hook to make that final by the end of May this year. Those are bolded because those are the ones we're going to dive into a little more detail today. The other strategies, the rodenticide strategy, did come out kind of together with a biological evaluation for the 11 rodenticides. Rodenticides, they're a little bit different and a little bit more of a specific group of pesticides they can look at all together. So they combine the assessment with the strategy, and that is now available for public comment. It came out on December 1st, and the comments are due the end of January. So if you're interested in that, that one is available right now. And then the insecticide strategy, we're expecting to see this spring. The finals due by January 2025. There's also a schedule for organophosphate biological evaluations due over the next couple of years. And then the fungicide strategy, kind of like, we'll deal with that next once they figure out the insecticide strategy. So that's everything that's coming. So I'm going to give you some details now on what EPA proposed and where they're headed with the Vulnerable Species Pilot Project, and then I will stop talking and hand it over to Cameron to talk about the herbicide strategy. So the Vulnerable Species Pilot Project, the draft plan was released June 22nd for a 6-week public comment period. Those comments were due in early August, and EPA's been going through them. So the goal here is to identify early mitigations for listed species that EPA has determined are particularly vulnerable to potential pesticide effects. And that early again is before going through that whole long consultation process with Fish and Wildlife Service, getting protections in place for the species, and then hopefully making that consultation step when they get there a lot easier, having already put a lot of these protections in place. So EPA, what they proposed was one set of mitigations for all conventional outdoor use pesticides for each of the species in the pilot, regardless of their differences in exposure or potential effects. And the mitigations were proposed to apply to all non-residential outdoor use sites. So that's agriculture, but also, forestry, golf courses, pasture and rangeland, mosquito applications. So it's quite a long list. And this is different from a lot of what EPA's put out there before, and it definitely made a big splash. The only exceptions are to the pesticides included here were rodenticides and avicides, because those uses are just so different that they were excluded from this. But all conventional insecticides or herbicides, fungicides, and so this did get quite a big reaction from stakeholders. And as I mentioned, EPA did put out an update to kind of give an idea of the direction they're going to move before this is implemented in November. And I'll talk about what they proposed, and then I will talk about where they say they're headed with this based on the comments they received. So EPA worked together with Fish and Wildlife Service to identify the species, and the criteria they used were the species had to be categorized as high or medium vulnerability by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that's in their documents. They have recovery plans and then 5-year reviews for every species that's listed. The species had to have limited ranges. So we're not talking about, migratory species that go across the whole country. And then pesticides had to be identified as a potential stressor in those documents, the recovery plan or the 5-year review. So they came up with 27 species across diverse set of taxa. So there's plants, terrestrial and aquatic invertebrates, vertebrates, fish, amphibian, birds, mammals, and they, a variety of habitats and locations across the continental US, nothing in Hawaii. And there's just a couple, pictures of examples of the species there on the slide. And then I'm going to put up, this is the list of all the species. I'm not going to read through them all, just to give you an idea if anything's familiar to you, and kind of the breakdown of what they included. And then probably more helpfully, this is their map of where the species ranges and designated critical habitats for those species that have them are. So it's not a great map. This is directly from EPA's document, but it helps just give an idea of where we're talking about. I mentioned one of the criteria was having a limited range. I think, for some of these cases, we were questioning whether that was met. You can see those big kind of peachy blobs in the middle of the country. That's the American burying beetle. It's pretty big range, and some of the other ones too. If you look up in the Pacific Northwest, that is the Taylor's checker spot butterfly, those kind of brown circles up there. That one caused a lot, not your region, but that one caused a lot of reaction. There's a lot of really high value agricultural land up there in Washington and Oregon that is covered by that range. So potential really big effects, and people in that area got very upset about this. Not as much in the Northeast, as you can see, and I'll kind of zoom in a little bit on that range in a few slides. So what EPA proposed for mitigations, they were going to implement it using that Bulletins Live 2 website that I've mentioned a couple times now. So that's what they use when they want to focus mitigations on a specific species area. So they can use that website to say, okay, only within this range on the map do these mitigations apply. It's not something we're putting on the label to apply to the whole country. So these would only apply within those areas you just saw on the map. And those bulletins include the two parts. So first of all, the location, which is called the pesticide use limitation area, or you'll hear it called a PULA. And then the mitigations that apply to those areas are the pesticide use limitations. And the limitation areas are based they propose basing them on species ranges and the critical habitats. So those are areas that have been defined by Fish and Wildlife Service. If you're familiar with their website, they have a platform called ECOS, ECOS, and that you can find the page for any of their listed species there. You can pull up the maps, their range maps. And Fish and Wildlife has been going through and updating their range maps since about 2018 too, which is great. A lot of them used to be based on kind of county borders, and now they're much more refined. And you can find all their recovery plans and 5-year reviews there too. It's a pretty good website actually, and easy to find what you need if you know what species you're looking for. And then the mitigation is broken up into 3 types. And again, this follows the Endangered Species Act, which has avoidance, minimization, and then compensatory mitigation, which we won't be talking about here. So the first type of mitigation is avoidance, and that's what it sounds like. No use of pesticides, avoid any possible exposure. And then for minimization, we're looking at those 2 pathways that EPA focuses on for reducing exposure to non-target species. So that's spray drift and runoff. And we'll say kind of runoff / erosion, because depending on the chemical properties of the pesticide, it might be running off dissolved in water or maybe sorbed to soil, but largely it's the same, oops, sorry about that, mitigation measures to prevent that. Okay. So for avoidance, it's again prohibition of use in key areas inhabited by the species. So for 6 of the species, EPA proposed following those delineated geographical boundaries based on the ranges and critical habitats. But then for the remaining 21 species, they weren't proposing to restrict all pesticide use within those ranges, but rather to restrict pesticide use based on the described habitat of the species within those ranges. So that gets pretty tricky, actually. Habitat descriptions vary by the species, but it's things like grasslands, prairies, creeks, streams, rivers, vernal pools. Could be really hard to figure out if you're, a pesticide applicator or a grower on the ground trying to identify if you're, within a boundary of that habitat within a species range. So we had some concerns about that. And then they proposed that, if somebody needed to use a pesticide within those ranges, they could get permission from a Fish and Wildlife Service field office. Lots of concerns there about how that would work in practice and whether Fish and Wildlife Service was prepared to deal with that type of system. And then minimization of spray drift. So the requirements that they're proposing vary by application equipment and droplet size. So when I say application equipment, I mean aerial versus ground for the most part, or air blast. They propose buffers to habitat areas only in the downwind direction if wind is blowing toward the habitat. And so that's something we were a big proponent of. There you can reduce the buffer size if you have a windbreak in place or something like that. And then the buffer sizes just vary by the species susceptibility. So the maximum they proposed for aerial buffers was 600 feet and for ground applications 100 feet. And then for runoff, I'd say for the spray drift, there's definitely some impacts there and some concerns, but I think a lot of the spray drift minimization measures are things that are already a little bit more common and growers know how to do in terms of the droplet sizes, different types of nozzles. Buffers can be very impactful, but understood, and definitely minimizing that impact with having them be wind directional. For runoff, we're in a little bit of a different world. It's harder to quantify runoff mitigation effects using the models that EPA has available to them and that they have validated and trust. And it's definitely something they've done less of. So it's just a little bit more like unclear how it's all going to work and raises a lot more stress, I would say, with all stakeholders involved. So these mitigations apply to 25 of the 27 species in the pilot. And the way EPA proposed it, there's a mitigation menu. Users have to select 4 practices in order to use pesticides in these mitigation areas. Exceptions are if a grower has tile drainage with a controlled outflow into a saturation buffer or retention pond. I'm not sure that would apply to anyone in Maine. And then also if the lands are managed with a site-specific runoff or erosion plan implemented according to the recommendations of a recognized conservation program or expert. What that actually means is something EPA is still figuring out, and we're talking to them a lot about. A lot of states have great conservation programs in place already, and we want to make sure that growers are getting credit if they're already participating in those and not being subject to a lot more requirements. But again, it's really still under discussion what that's actually going to look like. And then there are some timing restrictions as well, depending on the species. So this is that mitigation menu that I mentioned. This was how they proposed it with the vulnerable species. There's kind of another iteration of this that gets a little more complicated. There's a few more options that Cameron will talk about for the herbicide strategy. And the goal is ultimately, when they're using these types of mitigation menus, for them to be consistent. So I'm confident that this is not the final version, but you can see that trying to pick 4 things off this list is difficult, right? Depending on what your cropping system is, what kind of site you're on, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense agronomically. You'll also notice that there's a lot of overlap here with what folks think of as NRCS practices, and that's something that's been an ongoing discussion with USDA, how much EPA can or should be relying on NRCS for some of this, and whether that's an appropriate role for NRCS and use of their practices in this regulatory context. So a lot of ongoing discussions there. So finally, the last thing I'm going to show you for their proposal for the Vulnerable Species Project, they did put up this website with their proposal that's actually pretty cool. So they call it the Story Maps. It's a GIS-based website. Maybe when I stop sharing, I can share the link to this in the chat, or Cameron can do it. But if you Google, EPA vulnerable species story maps, it should come up pretty easily. So it's a website. I'm just going to click through some screenshots of that where you can see kind of what they're doing. What are these story maps? You can get a kind of a summary of where all these species are and what they are in the continental US. And then if you click on one of the species, it zooms in, and then this is actually like not that obvious. It was a little hard to find at first, but if you click on this learn more for any of these species, it takes you to a page that's just about that species and gives you a lot more information. So I'm going to show you what that looks like for the rusty patched bumblebee, because I think that is the only species in the currently proposed group that has habitat in or in range area in Maine. So it takes you, again, if you click on that learn more link, to the species specific page, and they have all these sections about the species, what their habitat's like, why are pesticides a concern, and then if you go to the EPA proposes mitigations, it takes you to a map, and so it has the range and critical habitat, and then it also pulls in the USDA cropland data layer that has all the kind of land cover, crop land cover from the last year. And so rusty patched bumblebee has kind of a crazy range with like lots of it was very specifically done with like lots of like little areas. See, those purple dots are all part of the rusty patch range, and they're kind of scattered throughout. But you can click on these links on the left side to zoom in on the different areas of their habitat. And so Maine is one of those options. If you click on Maine, it shows you this little area that's part of the rusty patch range in Waldo County. And for this species, that purple range area is avoidant. So that was one of the 6 species where the delineated range area is proposed to be avoidance area, which means you couldn't use pesticides within that range. And then there's also a 2,600-foot buffer around that range that would be subject to the minimization, those spray drift and runoff mitigation requirements. So this is maybe making it a little more like real, what I was talking about, how this could be implemented on the landscape. And so if you're familiar with this area, you probably know exactly where this is. And those blue patches are what comes up in the cropland data layer as blueberries. Those light green are other hay / non-alfalfa. Cropland data layer is not perfect. So, what is actually there in terms of hay and non-alfalfa hay, I'm not sure. But, this is kind of like where the rubber hits the road in terms of who's going to be impacted. What does this mean for them? And so if you're one of those blueberry growers in that polygon there on the map, this could potentially have huge impacts. So this is my last slide before I turn it over to Cameron, but as I mentioned, this got a lot of reaction, and EPA's already said, okay, like we understand we need to kind of rethink some of this. So this is what they've said they're going to do differently before implementation in the fall. We're encouraged by the direction. We're happy to see a lot of this, but it was a lot of, we're going to look at this. This is what we're intending to do, but not a lot of commitments at this point. So in terms of what it will ultimately look like, we don't have necessarily a lot of details. So for those pesticide use limitation areas, EPA has committed to refining them beyond just the species range. I should mention too, Cameron has told me from his Maine perspective that rusty patch bumblebee habitat in Maine is questionable. The experts there don't think that it was a misidentification of a species, and it might not even be rusty patch bumblebee that in Maine at all. And so that just shows you the importance of knowing what's around your area and of knowing your local fish and wildlife staff, engaging with them, making sure these things are accurate, making sure that folks know what species are there, what crops are there, what it means, what's really going on. These are not just polygons on a map, they do impact folks. So EPA is also refining those pesticide use limitation areas to narrow the areas to only include locations that are really important to species conservation. So where are the species actually located within that range? That's something they're working out in SOP now, working together with some experts at University of Georgia to come up with a method for that. So we don't know exactly what that will look like, but we're hopeful that it will limit those areas where the mitigations are applicable, and especially those avoidance areas. They are potentially narrowing the scope for non-agricultural uses, so limiting those to mosquito adulticide applications, rangeland, forestry, and invasive species management. So that would take the pressure off some of those other uses like golf courses, residential type applications, rights of way. For the exemptions, they've recognized they need to clarify those and figure out if maybe other exemptions are needed. So I said they're still really, especially that conservation program exemption, still trying to figure out exactly what that means. I think that's going to be really important here. So that's something we're very engaged on. For mitigations, they've said they're going to revise some of the proposed mitigations and include additional options, especially for some of those non-ag uses. A lot of those things on that pick list, that menu I showed you, really don't apply at all to non-ag. So they didn't really have a lot of options. And then also specialty crops didn't really have enough options. EPA has also said that their current thinking for agricultural uses is that the proposed mitigations wouldn't include avoidance. So instead of saying you can't use any pesticides unless you talk to your local fish and wildlife office, saying, okay, you can use them if you're following the minimization mitigations, because they realized that the capacity wasn't there with Fish and Wildlife Service, and that also the likely outcome would be Fish and Wildlife Service saying you can use the pesticides if you're following these mitigations. So they're thinking they might just skip ahead to that. So that's really, good for minimizing impacts on agriculture. There's still those runoff and drift mitigations have a lot of impact, but at least there's options for folks that need the pesticides. They're also going to look again at how they selected the pilot species and include at least some risk-based component. I think that will be looking at, existing risk assessments for the pesticides. So if they don't even have an impact, say, on terrestrial invertebrates at all, say it's an herbicide that doesn't impact terrestrial invertebrates, then you wouldn't have to put mitigations in place for, say the rusty patch bumblebee, although many herbicides do impact the habitat for invertebrates. So that's a consideration too. But we were glad to see at least some risk consideration there. So anyways, potentially really impactful program that they're putting in place. Limited to this 27 species to start, but could be expanded to other species defined as vulnerable. And we will know more in September of this year. So now I will hand it over to Cameron to talk about the herbicide strategy.
Thanks, Elyssa. I was actually wondering if we wanted to pause maybe and see if folks had questions. You covered a lot of material.
That's a good idea.
Excellently, but really quickly. Do folks have questions on kind of the more general ESA topics that Elyssa presented on and or the vulnerable species pilot. We'll hopefully have time for questions at the end too, but I thought this might be a good time for a pause and people can collect their thoughts a little bit.
Thank you for the reminder to pause.
No worries. If not, we can keep going too and come back to it.
Yeah, I think we can definitely have some time at the end for questions. The first time I heard this, it was so overwhelming that I didn't know what to ask. So maybe a little bit more time would be good.
Yep, sounds good. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about EPA's proposed herbicide strategy. This is has some similarities to the vulnerable species pilot project that Elyssa talked about, but also a number of significant differences. The first is that unlike the vulnerable species pilot project, which has a bit of a vague path to implementation, the herbicide strategy and then the insecticide strategy and fungicide strategy, which are coming in the next few years, are meant to be integrated into the standard sort of FIFRA re-registration timeline. What this means is that this herbicide strategy is meant to directly inform programmatic consultations that EPA plans to have with Fish and Wildlife Service and maybe NIMS for some of the insecticides and fungicides down the road as part of the re-registration process. So this herbicide strategy, I'll go into a little bit more details, but we expect to see this implemented on labels possibly even this year on draft preliminary interim decisions. So the herbicide strategy is something we will see implemented pretty quickly, we think, including on some potentially very impactful and large-scale use cases like something 2,4-D is one of the first cases we suspect we might see the herbicide strategy framework implemented on. Some other significant differences is that the herbicide strategy covers only agricultural pesticide uses. Again, only in the lower 48 states. So Elyssa mentioned the separate Hawaii strategy that EPA has that is ongoing. And this does not involve any non-agricultural, so non-row crop uses. So even something like forestry is not included as part of the herbicide strategy right now. Practically, we suspect that scope might drift a little bit once we actually see this on labels. Obviously, as you all know, many herbicides have both row crop uses and other non-row crop uses. And as EPA actually tries to roll out this framework on labels, we suspect they will have to slowly start incorporating some of those non-agricultural uses. So that's something we're keeping our eye on. The herbicide strategy directly considers impacts to 400 listed plant species and roughly 500 listed animals that are generalists or obligates and depend on plant species for either forage or for habitat. Something else that's different and that we're very happy to see with the herbicide strategy is that the type and level of mitigation is specific to chemical properties. The actual risk that a given herbicide proposes through a given use pattern. And so in that sense, the exposure analysis that EPA does to support implementation of the herbicide strategy is a little bit more similar to what they already do for FIFRA and re-registration. And because that it is based on risk, it's a little bit more evidence-based than what they've proposed so far for the vulnerable species strategy. Next slide, Elyssa. So overall, the herbicide strategy framework sort of has three components to it, and I'll go into each of these components in a little bit more detail, and then we'll talk about some specific examples that I think might be relevant to some of your constituents here in Maine. Next slide. So the first step is, in this first step, EPA carries out a streamlined assessment to determine which groups of plants are likely to be potentially impacted from direct exposure to an herbicide. This is essentially an abbreviated risk assessment, and it's based on a chemical's herbicide's physiochemical properties. It's based on plant toxicity studies, both those that are submitted by the registrant as part of registration, but also the available literature, and also the estimated exposure for each crop use. So this part of the herbicide strategy is very similar to what we see in the ecological and environmental fate assessments that EPA does already for many herbicides. Next step. Alyssa's ahead of me. All right. So if in that first step, at least one group of listed plant species is determined to be potentially impacted, then EPA moves on to step 2. In this step, EPA identifies which mitigations are necessary and the extent of those mitigations. These mitigations are very similar to what we saw with the Vulnerable Species Pilot Project, and again, focus primarily on spray drift and exposure via runoff. So for the mitigation, the extent of these mitigations are specific for the herbicide strategy to each formulated product for each herbicide, and they're influenced by important factors such as the use site, so the crop an herbicide is being applied to, the maximum use rates allowed on the label, and other application parameters, such as whether you're applying via aerial application equipment, ground applications, or air blast equipment. So for spray drift, for most herbicides, we could have buffers anywhere from 0, sort of the best case, if there's no potential for exposure via spray drift, or worst case, up to 300 feet, depending again on all of these factors, as well as habitat type and proximity to listed species ranges or habitats. Again, we see the greatest potential for buffer requirements for aerial applications, just because typically that's where we see the greatest exposure potential for spray drift, and the narrowest potential buffers from air blast applications. EPA is also proposing that these buffer requirements would be reduced if producers are using certain drift reduction practices. Currently, the drift reduction practices EPA is proposing giving folks credit for include installation of windbreaks or the use of hooded sprayers. And we've provided some feedback, as did other stakeholders, suggesting that EPA could broaden the definition of some of the drift reduction agents that they're giving folks credit for. Next slide. So for runoff and soil erosion mitigations, each herbicide for the herbicide strategy is assigned a mitigation level of 3, 6, or 9 points based on their potential for offsite movement via soil or water. Producers would then have to implement a corresponding number of runoff soil erosion mitigation measures from the available menu, with a few exceptions. And this again is similar to what we saw for the Vulnerable Species Pilot Project. So these exceptions to the need for runoff mitigations include use of tile drainage if a field is more than 1,000 feet away from listed species habitat, or if lands are managed using a site-specific runoff or soil erosion plan. NRCS programs would we think qualify for this last exemption, but this exemption is something that we're working quite closely with EPA and NRCS and other private conservation organizations on. Next slide, Elyssa. Coming back a little bit to the spray drift buffer, something I wanted to highlight is that EPA's proposal allows for certain structures and areas outside of the treated field to be included as part of these spray drift buffers. And so what we mean by that is that for a given herbicide and a given use site, if EPA was saying you had to have a 100-foot buffer, the measurement of that buffer could include roads, whether they're pervious or impervious, buildings, and existing conservation planting areas. We highlight this because this is a lot more flexibility than we've seen in previous spray drift buffer requirements from EPA. And again, we're sort of happy that EPA has listened to stakeholder feedback in terms of how folks should measure these spray drift buffers, because we do often hear from stakeholders that these spray drift buffers, previous iterations of these, were required to be infield spray drift buffers, which ended up causing significant impacts potentially for growers because they'd essentially have to take acreage out of production in order to meet the spray drift buffer requirement. So we are seeing sort of an evolution of EPA's thinking on this, which we think is positive. Next slide, Elyssa. So with regards to the runoff and soil erosion mitigation menus, these again are similar to what we saw for the Vulnerable Species Pilot Project, with the important addition now of these points. Essentially, the points that EPA has assigned for each of these practices are EPA's best estimate of the practical efficacy for each of these practices in reducing runoff or soil erosion. So for example, if a grower were to implement infield vegetative filter strips, EPA's best estimate based on the available literature and data that they have is that that would be most effective in terms of reducing soil erosion or runoff, whereas something like irrigation water management is somewhat less effective, and EPA is only proposing to give 1 point to that practice. This is a little bit similar to what we saw going back to some of the early enlist labels, which have been out for almost 2 years, with the addition of some new practices. There's been a lot of stakeholder feedback on this pick list of runoff and soil erosion mitigations, going back to when we first saw these on enlist 2 years ago. And again, we're happy that EPA has shown a willingness to add practices to this pick list, as long as stakeholders are able to document and provide evidence that these practices have a meaningful benefit for soil erosion and runoff mitigation. Some of the newer practices on this list that EPA has added with its herbicide strategy include farming on fields with less than 2% overall slopes, and farming in certain areas of the western US with natural precipitation that falls outside of the growing season. That covers it. Next slide, and we'll move on to step 3. So this is sort of the final step of the herbicide strategy framework. And in this step, EPA determines the geographic extent of the required mitigations. There are essentially 2 categories of geographic extents. The first is mitigations that will go on the general product label and apply everywhere in the United States, or everywhere in essentially everywhere in the United States. These general product label mitigations are when EPA determines that the use of an herbicide could have impacts on the diet or habitat of listed animals that are generalists. And so they rely on a potentially impacted listed plant for either forage or habitat. These maps, again, are pulled from EPA's risk assessment, so they're a little hard to look at. But if you want to focus on map D in the lower right-hand corner, this is essentially a cumulative map of the other 3 maps, which represent specific terrestrial species or wetland species in the case of maps A and B, and then C is aquatic species. So map D is essentially all 3 of those previous maps added on. And with a few exceptions, which are the white areas in map D, you can see that essentially most of the United States would have new general label requirements added to herbicides used anywhere in the red or bluish shaded areas of the United States. So essentially what this means is that most herbicides moving forward will have some of these mitigations on their labels. So this obviously represents a fairly substantial change to the regulation of herbicides in the United States, which is one of the reasons we're trying to do all this outreach and just make people aware of this. Moving on, next slide, we look at the sort of second set of geographic mitigation extents, which are additional on top of the general label requirements. These are specific to certain pesticide use limitation areas of listed plants that would be directly impacted by herbicide use. So in this case, we again have 4 maps. Map A is terrestrial dicots and obligates. Map B is terrestrial monocots and obligate animal species. Map C is wetland dicot plants or obligate animal species. And map D is wetland monocots or grasses and obligate animal species, sorry. You'll notice that there are some pictures on maps B and D, and those represent specific listed plant species that I'll go into a little bit more detail on in the next few slides, which do have ranges according to Fish and Wildlife in Maine. And so again, we just wanted to sort of highlight the potential for real world impacts from this herbicide strategy for some producers in Maine. These PULAs will be represented on the Bulletin's Live 2 website moving forward. So what that means is that for some herbicides with use in areas of Maine moving forward, you will see on the label a specific requirement that growers have to visit the Bulletin's Live 2 website within a certain time period before they do applications in order to identify what the required mitigations are for them in that use area. So moving on, a few specific examples of listed plant species that do have ranges in Maine. So Eastern Prairie Fringe Orchid not only has current ranges in 5 counties from what I could pull from Fish and Wildlife in Maine, primarily sort of in northern Maine, but also throughout a lot of the Northwest and other parts of the Northeast. So this is the one listed plant species I could find that probably has the biggest range currently in Maine, but this is a pretty heavily agricultural portion of the state. So the potential impact for potato producers and others in northern Maine could be significant from if the herbicide strategy as it moves forward. The other species, moving on to the next slide, have relatively more limited ranges. Furbish Lastwort was a new plant species for me and has a very limited range up in Aroostook County, essentially right along a single river system. So the potential impact for mitigations for this are probably likely to be limited compared to what we saw for the prairie fringed orchid. Moving on to the next slide, small world pogonia has some limited ranges sort of in southwestern Maine, so Androscoggin, Cumberland County. But again, there are a lot of smaller scale producers in that part of the state. So overall, I wanted to present these examples just to sort of illustrate and hammer home the idea that this will impact a lot of your constituents sooner or later, depending on herbicides as they go through the registration review process. Next slide. In the herbicide strategy that was proposed, EPA tried to present some herbicide-specific examples of what this risk assessment and exposure assessment would actually look like. And the case study herbicides that they used are ones that EPA is currently being litigated on. So these are cases where EPA proposed label changes and environmental groups sued them for lack of ESA compliance or other shortcomings. These include some pretty major herbicides, 2,4-D, dicamba, and some smaller ones like trifluralin or oxyflorphine. I wanted to walk through 2 examples that I understand have some use in Maine. The first one I wanted to present on the next slide is 2,4-D. And I apologize for how small the font on these tables ended up being. You don't need to focus as much on the specific details. I wanted to sort of present an overall illustrative example of what spray drift mitigations could look like. And so essentially what we see for all of these herbicides, the far left-hand vertical column is the application rate. And so essentially we see that for uses of 2,4-D at 2 pounds acid equivalent per acre, we have the largest windbreaks, up to 300 feet in some cases, if you're using aerial applications, depending on the spray droplet size. If you're making ground applications, again, depending on spray droplet size, you could only be required to have a spray drift buffer of 100 feet. If you're using lower applications, spray drift requirement is further reduced. And then again, in the last horizontal column in the table, we see all of the buffer reduction options. So if you're using a windbreak, you reduce the buffer by half. If the environmental conditions, such as relative humidity, exceed 70%, you again could reduce some of your buffers. So there's a lot of detail and nuance to the spray drift buffer requirements, which on the one hand is good, on the other hand, it's complicated and will likely be hard for folks to understand. Moving on to the next slide. This is the soil erosion and runoff mitigation requirements. And so essentially these are the number of points that correspond to the number of required conservation practices in order to reduce soil erosion and runoff that are required for 2,4-D uses on certain crops. And so focusing first on the general label requirements. So this would apply to all uses of 2,4-D anywhere in, if you can remember, it's sort of that map of the United States that covers most of the country. So for uses with lower application rates, like citrus and grapes, we see grower would only need to get to 3 points. So whether that's one practice like infield vegetative filter strips that has an efficacy score of 3, or whether that's using 3 individual practices that each have a score of 1, there could be some different options for growers to get to that 3 points. For uses like all of the other ones, including field corn, orchards, row crops, vegetables, because they have higher application rates, you would be required to get up to 6 points. So that the burden for implementing conservation practices is higher with uses that have higher application rates. And then in the last 2 columns, PULA 1 and 3, these are essentially saying that you would be required to do additional practices if you were a grower in an area where those listed species were present. So PULA 1 is the Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid up in northern Maine. So if you're a producer in Aroostook County, you would be required to implement enough practices to get 6 points, essentially across the board, regardless of what crop you were growing. And then if you were in southwestern Maine, Cumberland County, for example, where I'm located, for some of these uses, field corn grower, you might even have to get up to 9 points. So again, there's an added level of complexity and a potential for some growers to be required to invest substantially in order to implement enough conservation practices to get up to something like 9 points. I wanted to conclude with a little bit more of a limited example. If you want to move on to the next slide, Elyssa, oxyflorphin has a little bit more of a limited usage than something like 2,4-D, and a little bit of a different risk picture. Again, though, we see sort of the general framework for these spray drift mitigations of variations depending on how you're applying it, what rate you're applying it at, anywhere again from 10 feet buffers for ground applications to 300-foot buffers for aerial applications. So I think that 0 to 300 range is pretty typical for most herbicides based on what EPA's exposure modeling looks like. If you want to move on to the next slide, Elyssa. Oxyflorphin has a lot more minor crop uses. And so again, we see sort of this general framework where we have general label requirements of anywhere from 5 points all the way up to 7 points. So essentially EPA is saying that they are estimating that oxyflorphin poses a greater exposure potential via soil erosion and runoff. And so they're proposing additional point requirements. One of the interesting thing for oxyflorphin, at least, is that there's not a big difference between the general label requirements and the PULA specific point requirements. So unlike 2,4-D, where we had anywhere from 3 to 9 points, for oxyflorphin, it's essentially 5 to 7 points sort of across the board. I was hoping that these examples might not just confuse everyone, but might present sort of a real world picture of what this might look like. Again, I think we'll know a lot more as we see this come out on actual proposed labels. So we expect to see this coming out first on 2,4-D and dicamba. Both of those are registration review cases that EPA has been dragging their feet on a little bit, but we expect those to come out in the next quarter or two. And we'll know a lot more when we actually see this on a label and understand how these mitigations under the herbicide strategy interact with existing label mitigations for these herbicides. And with that, we can kind of move on to the next slide. And this has our email addresses. I did want to emphasize that, I'm based in Scarborough. I work remotely. So I certainly hope and want to make myself available to all of you. If you have grower groups or constituents that are interested in learning more about this, I'm happy to come and talk to those groups. I hope to be up in Augusta next week for at least a day or two of the Maine Ag trade show, and happy to meet with folks. Tori has my phone number too. If you email me, I'm happy to give that to you too. I'm happy to talk to folks. I hope to use my location in Maine as an advantage for you all and for your growers. I've already spoken to Wild Blueberry Commission. I've spoken to folks at the Board Pesticide Control. Compared to other states, I think regulators and some stakeholder groups in Maine are way ahead of the curve in terms of awareness and engagement on this issue, which is fantastic. But hopefully, again, I think it only benefits growers and stakeholder groups and regulators in states to be aware of what's going on and be able to proactively prepare for it, rather than being in a position when label changes are proposed and having to react to those. Because these are essentially structural changes for some production systems that will take time to implement, and they will take resources. So that's another aspect of all of this that we're working on quite a bit internally in USDA, is to understand what potential impacts of this could be for NRCS programs, for crop insurance programs, for financial assistance programs that are existing. The implications of this for a lot of federal agencies, not only USDA, but other federal agencies that manage lands, are pretty significant. And we're trying to understand those and trying to work together with EPA moving forward so that can be as smooth a transition as possible. I see we already have a few questions in the chat, so maybe that's a good place to start, and then we can kind of open it up. See who was the first. Oh, I see Lily, I think, was the first question. Lily's question was, will farmers be paid for the loss of crop yield due to these new requirements? Other than label being law, how will these new rules be enforced? She points out that growers are upset and therefore demanding to be paid, or just not following the rules. So the answer to your first question is, we don't know. That question has been asked quite a bit to other parts of USDA, and I think we're still trying to sort that out. Funding is always a big question mark. There is no specific compensatory funding attached to this, the rollout of these ESA requirements. So I think the question for folks in USDA is, where would that funding come from if we wanted to try to provide financial assistance to growers to sort of offset any potential impacts from these requirements? Where would that funding come from? And to quickly answer sort of your second question, you all are certainly aware that the primacy for enforcement of any pesticide regulations occurs through the states. And that does not change with any of these proposed ESA-related mitigations. So even though, so essentially it's up to the Board of Pesticide Control here in Maine to enforce any of this. To that end, there has been some coordination between EPA and SFIREG, the state FIFRA issues regulatory group that has a Maine Board of Pesticides Control representative to it, along with other state lead agencies. We have been pushing those groups to interact more frequently because we see the importance of that. Ultimately, this is going to further complicate already very complicated pesticide labels. And if this is to work in the long run, states have to, at a minimum, understand what they're enforcing. And I can sort of candidly tell you right now that there's a lot of questions from state lead agencies on what EPA is proposing and how they're meant to enforce it. So that will be a big thing we will watch moving forward. I don't know, Elyssa, if you want to correct any of my responses or add anything.
Nope, I totally agree.
So unfortunately, more questions than answers at this point on a lot of those things. The next question I see in the chat, Brett asked if the regulation allows for exceptions to apply pesticides in the pesticide use limitation areas. Can growers petition for an exception? Not as part of the herbicide strategy framework. There aren't really exceptions to those mitigation requirements. There were some exceptions in the original vulnerable species pilot project that essentially if a grower were to work with their local Fish and Wildlife office, they could get an exemption from the avoidance. Is that correct, Elyssa? And that might have changed in the most recent update.
And yeah, EPA has indicated that for agriculture, there they're basically just going to get rid of the avoidance because that was determined to not really be a realistic path forward. There's some, I guess there's some precedent for that type of model of working through your local Fish and Wildlife office to determine, what's permitted through the for mosquito adulticide applicators, and that's something they've worked on a lot with that group, the AMCA, American Mosquito Control Association. But I haven't seen anything that looks like it's going to work in that way for agriculture.
And then the next question I see, just to be clear, only the specific herbicides and species are located will have to follow new regulations. Will it eventually apply to all products and all crops? Short answer is yes. So the herbicide strategy framework will be rolled out via registration review, and we're sort of at the end of one cycle and sort of beginning another cycle. But eventually, over the next 15 years, we will see some iteration of these herbicide strategy mitigations applied to all herbicide labels. And moving forward, once we see the insecticide strategy and fungicide strategy, all of those pesticides as well. And I guess just to clarify one thing, so there are general label requirements. So there are some spray drift and runoff mitigations that will be required almost anywhere in the US that a product is labeled for use on an agricultural row crop. In those PULAs, those limited areas where there are also listed plants that occur, there's an additional need for mitigation on top of the general label requirements. Elyssa, I don't know if you want to further add anything to that.
No, that's right. There will be those two layers, some things that apply throughout the country due to just basically the occurrence of listed species that may rely on plants throughout essentially the whole continental US, and then some things that are specific just to those locations. I'm curious, how many of you are familiar with Bulletins Live 2? Have you heard of it? Is that not even heard of it? Okay, so that's going to be a really big deal, and we didn't have time to go into it today. EPA did do a webinar on it, just like a couple months ago, and I need to double check if we have the link to that recording, because it's worth watching just to familiarize yourself with what is this website, what is this system, and how does it work, because that's how all of those location-specific restrictions are going to be communicated. And it's a website that's been around for a long time, but hasn't been widely used. So, we are definitely seeing the need to communicate a lot more about that. Looks like the next question, anything to add to that, Cameron, before I go to the next one?
No, I found the URL for the recording of that, and I'll post it in the chat for folks to look at.
Great. So the next question I think is for me, pollinators, where can we find out more about those changes? So yeah, I mentioned that because I was talking about, the rusty patch bumblebee in particular at that point. So I think where you really want to look for things focused on pollinators is in the upcoming insecticide strategy. So I can't remember exactly what the specific deadline is for the draft release. I think it's June, maybe the end of June, but I know that EPA is trying to beat that. In the mega suit settlement, there's like the due date, and then they said, but they have to like try to do it earlier. It's kind of weird wording, I think, for a settlement agreement, but they've said that they're aiming for earlier in the spring. So definitely keep your eye out for the draft insecticide strategy, because that's where you're going to see a focus on impacts on invertebrates, and that's basically where many of the pollinators fall. So all of those kind of pollinator focused approaches are going to be in the insecticide strategy. The herbicide strategy, as Cameron's mentioned, really focuses on the effects to plants themselves.
Those are all the questions I see in the chat, but we have a little bit more time if folks have questions they want to say verbally. And while folks are doing that, I'm going to put my email address and work phone number in the chat in case people want to reach out to me directly. Happy to do that, and happy to touch base with folks next week in Augusta if you'll be at the trade show.
I had a question about the species, and apologies if I missed this, but could you clarify the rollout of the pilot species versus the theoretically all endangered species and like herbicide versus pesticide and yeah.
Yeah, it's really confusing. There's so many different things going on at once. For the vulnerable species project, so the rollout is going to be dependent on getting those bulletins up. All of that is going to be through the bulletins live too. So EPA, I think the first like potential, hey, this is live could be in September of this year. I don't know if it will be that quick or if they'll put something out that says kind of what they are going to do and then when the bulletins will be live. You know, we don't have an exact schedule for when that will be implemented. But that will just focus on specific species. And then the herbicide strategy, insecticide strategy, and fungicide strategy, between those three, you're talking about, you know, all conventional pesticides, and those will go into effect through the specific registration review cases as they go through the 15-year cycle. So, you know, for everything to be impacted, I think it will be, you know, it will be years. It will be 15 to 20 years at least. But once you start getting these types of restrictions on chemicals like 2,4-D, dicamba, you know, widely used herbicides or insecticides or fungicides, I think, you know, we're going to see a lot of similar restrictions in terms of the spray drift mitigations, the runoff requirements. So it's the kind of thing where once you get like a few widely used chemicals with the restrictions on their labels, I think you're gonna see a lot of the U.S. covered very quickly, and then once you're complying with a lot of those additional restrictions that come up, may not have any kind of you know, extra impact. They may or may not, depending on your specific location. But would you agree with that, Cameron? That kind of once you're complying, you're probably a lot of the way there for most
Yeah,
chemicals.
for sure. And the other thing I'd add is that we are seeing a proactive effort by registrants to add this to new active ingredients that they're trying to get registered by EPA. A couple of years ago, EPA instituted a new policy where they were started doing ESA assessments for all new use or new active ingredient registrations. And registrants have and that has caused significant delays in the registration of new products. So registrants more and more are proactively including ESA-related mitigations in their essentially petition packages to EPA. So you could see some of these requirements maybe earlier on new products that are coming out over the next few years, especially for maybe the fungicides, which are sort of the last strategy to come out. The registrants are kind of trying to get ahead of the game in order to make sure that things are registered on time.
Thanks. And follow-up question, if a grower's not part of like a grower group that's super proactively involved, like is the primary way they're going to find out about a new restriction on a product they use just going to be an updated label? Like I'm trying to figure out, like, from the grower perspective, like when are they going to actually learn that this is an issue? Is it going to be that they're going to buy a product or look at the label and be like, oh, there's new things on there?
Potentially, that's what we'd really like to avoid that.
Yeah, we are. We're trying to do a lot of outreach. The starting point for us is really through extension experts like you all, and we're trying to sort of pilot this with you all, and rolling this out to other states. But we're also trying to, you know, we have relationships with a lot of the agricultural retailers, a lot of the crop consultants, both independent ones and ones affiliated with industry, and we are encouraging everyone who will listen to us to try to do education and outreach to the growers they work with, so that that's not the case. I mean, we all, I think, want growers to be aware of these and educated about these changes coming down the road. Because again, these are implementing any of these practices, if a grower's not already doing them, will require time and money. Whether that money comes from the government or the grower or someone else, you can't just do any of these overnight. And for a grower to sort of get ahead of the curve and be prepared, whether they need 6 points or 9 points, if they go ahead and start doing that now, they'll be in a much better position when they actually need to show that they've met those requirements in 5 years or 10 years.
Thanks. That's really helpful language to explain to a grower why they should be thinking about it now, because sounds like they won't be able to do it
Yeah. And
automatically.
we want feedback from you all. I mean, you all are the communication experts when it comes to growers, and this is really, really complicated. Elyssa and I presented on this maybe a dozen times in the last 6 months, and I feel like every time we present on it, we still sort of stumble over things because it's so complicated. So any feedback that you all have to us on how we could distill this and present it to growers in a simplified manner would be super useful to us as we try to keep working on this.
Thank you, guys. The specific examples are the most useful. And I bet there's a lot more in these regulations than you've provided in examples. I wonder how much more is hidden that like is in some document that we're gonna have to read.
Yeah, it's hundreds of pages that, just for these two strategies alone that EPA has released for review. And it's a tricky balance too, because, they're proposals and they're still subject to change, but we're pretty sure that, we have a pretty good picture of what's coming in terms of like the general landscape. So want to communicate it without sharing details that still might be changing before things are finalized. But we'd be happy to point you in the direction of those hundreds of pages if you want to read more.
And we also,
yet.
I mean, we often work with grower groups, and so I offer the service to all of you too to help distill some of those documents. Because again, EPA's risk assessments are very complicated documents or their mitigation proposals. We are relatively good at understanding them and sometimes in distilling those to sort of bullet points. So if you ever come across a product label or something from EPA that you have trouble understanding, feel free to reach out to us. I mean, you have my email address now. I can forward you to my colleagues who are entomologists and plant pathologists. If you have specific questions on any of this, please reach out to us. I mean, we're here to help you all and to help growers ultimately. So if you ever come across something that doesn't make sense to you, we can either help simplify it, or we can go directly to EPA, which we sometimes do, and say, what do you mean by this? Because we don't even understand what you're talking about. And they're usually pretty good about helping to provide clarification. Sometimes someone made a mistake down the way and something ended up on a label that was a mistake. It does happen sometimes. And that kind of outreach can be really helpful in correcting those mistakes.
See in the chat, Brett asked, would you be interested in partnering with extension educators to give presentations to grower associations? Yes, definitely. I don't know the answer to the second question.
So I've had a number of conversations with Pam specifically about this. I don't want to speak for her or get her in trouble. DACF is aware of this issue. From what I understand, they're not sure it's a super high priority right now. But the offer is on the table, both to them and to all of you to invite me or Elyssa or anyone else to come speak to your grower groups about it.
Any final questions this morning as we start to digest this? Please do take advantage of the email addresses that Cameron and Elyssa have shared with us. I've got them too if you misplace it. I'm really hoping that we can be proactive about this for our growers, and I do encourage you to arrange grower meetings specifically about this topic, ideally ahead of the growing season so you can catch them while they're not as busy. I'm happy to help out with organizing that if you like. So with that, thank you so much, Cameron and Elyssa. This has been really helpful and useful to introduce this to our extension folks. We will have a recording that we'll share with everyone for those who weren't able to be here. And I anticipate we'll be working with you much more in the future.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone.